They nailed a demolition notice to the cabin I built with my husband. The only problem? I was never part of their HOA. The mist over the lake hung low that morning, as if the world itself was still deciding whether to wake up. Everything was soft, quiet, wrapped in a gray hush that seemed to hold the edges of the cabin in place. I stood barefoot on the porch, cradling a mug of Earl Grey, steam curling up into the cold air. The wood beneath my feet still held the chill from the night before, and the birds had not yet dared to sing. That was the kind of morning it was, the kind that felt untouched, like it belonged to no one but me. This was my time, my space, my home. I took a sip and let the warmth settle in my chest. The teacup had been a gift from Thomas, my husband. He had always teased me for drinking fancy tea, while he brewed his strong black coffee like a lumberjack. But he made sure I never ran out of Earl Grey. That was the kind of man he was. It had been 6 months since cancer took him, and yet, some mornings, I still reached out across the bed before remembering there was no one there. Grief is a quiet house. It makes noise only when you are listening for love. The dock stretched out from the backyard like a wooden finger pointing into the fog. I had planned to take my tea down there, maybe sit for a while with the memory of Thomas beside me, but something orange caught my eye. It was bright, a jarring artificial slap of color. And it was not there yesterday. I stepped off the porch and followed the gravel path toward the boat shed. The damp grass clung to my robe, but I did not care. My gaze was locked on the vivid sheet flapping slightly in the breeze. It was nailed, not taped, to the wooden door. A thick silver nail driven right into the cedar plank we had stained together the summer we built it. I felt my stomach tighten. That single nail already felt like a violation. I pulled it out with my fingers, leaving a small puncture wound in the wood. The paper tore as I freed it, but the message remained sickeningly clear. Final notice. Demolition scheduled. $14,982 in unpaid HOA fees. I read it again, and then a third time. Beneath the headline was a list of alleged violations: non-compliant paint scheme, unapproved dock structure, failure to attend community safety meetings, all of it issued by an organization called the Lakeshore Hills Homeowners Association. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something colder: disbelief. I was not part of any homeowners association. My land was private, inherited from my grandfather, and had never been annexed. The property line was as old as the trees that bordered it. I had the deed tucked away in my desk drawer, the official survey maps, even the tax documents that confirmed what I already knew, that I had nothing to do with the new development down the road or its eager board of neighborhood rulers. And yet, here was this paper, nailed like a final insult into the door of a building my late husband and I had built with our own hands. The letter claimed I had 3 days to respond. After that, demolition would begin. They even included a phone number to resolve the matter promptly and avoid further penalties. It was absurd. It was offensive. It was wrong. But it was not a mistake. Not with the way the nail had been driven so deep. Not with the phrasing that sounded more like a threat than a notice. Not with the fee calculated to the cent, meant to scare, not to inform. I stood there for a long moment, the paper in one hand, the nail in the other. The lake behind me was still silent, the mist rolling across its surface like breath across glass. Maybe someone else would have crumpled the paper and walked away. Maybe another widow would have told herself it was just a clerical error, something that would sort itself out. Maybe someone else would have been afraid, but not me, not now. I walked back into the house and set the nail on the kitchen table. It clicked against the wood like punctuation. They thought they were sending a warning. They thought I would back down, sell out, or quietly disappear like so many others. But what they did not know, what they could never have imagined, is that before I was a grieving widow in a cabin by the lake, I was the one wearing the robe and holding the gavel. I was the one who decided whose papers held weight and whose were lies. And now, someone had just nailed a lie into my front door. I may be old, I may be grieving, but they just picked the wrong house. And they have no idea who I used to be. Ever seen someone try to erase your entire life with a forged piece of paper? Let me tell you what happened next. They say grief moves in waves, but no one warns you that some days it just sits still, heavy, unmoving, like fog over still water. That was how it had been for me for the last 6 months. After Thomas passed, I stopped keeping track of days. The world outside the cabin moved on. Trash trucks came and went. Birds returned to nest. The HOA sent newsletters to mailboxes I never read. But inside these walls, time folded in on itself. He died in early spring. Pancreatic cancer. Quick and cruel. We had hoped to spend our twilight years in the little cabin we built with our own hands, waking to the sound of loons on the lake, drinking coffee on the dock, tending to our garden beds like old poets caring for wild verses. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Thomas had been a defense attorney, brilliant, stubborn, and often infuriating, especially when we found ourselves arguing opposite sides of a hypothetical legal scenario over dinner. We used to joke that our kitchen table had heard more compelling closing arguments than half the courtrooms in Colorado. He always said I was better at the big picture, while he handled the gray areas. I never told him, but I often thought he was right. After he was gone, I withdrew, not out of fear, not out of shame, but out of exhaustion. The courtroom had taken most of my life. The public eye had claimed what was left. I had been appointed to the federal bench at the age of 43 and presided over some of the most complex criminal cases in the western states. I wore the robe for 24 years, signed more warrants than I could count, and once sent a cartel lieutenant to federal prison for life, despite the threats left on my porch and the federal protection that followed. But here, at the edge of the lake, none of that mattered. The courtroom, the headlines, the decisions etched into law books, they all faded into silence when Thomas and I laid the final beam on the roof of our cabin. We had sworn that this would be the place where we were no longer Judge and Counselor Whitaker, just Ellie and Tom, two tired warriors planting tomatoes and arguing about crossword puzzles. And for a while, it worked, until he got sick. Until the silence became mine alone. When the funeral ended and the last of the casseroles stopped arriving, I found myself shrinking into the quiet. I stopped answering calls, stopped checking email. I removed myself from the local listserv, declined the neighborhood wellness check-ins, and let the world forget me, which, in hindsight, made me a perfect target. That was around the same time Miranda Keller took over the HO. I did not know her personally, though I had seen her once or twice at the grocery store in town late 40s, perhaps early 50s. Always in crisp linen, her blonde bob perfectly sculpted, voice like syrup left too long in the sun. She was the kind of woman who made polite sound like a threat, and kindness feel like an inspection. I heard whispers that she had moved in from California and immediately started pushing for beautification initiatives and community standard enforcement. What that actually meant, in plain English, was control. People like Miranda thrive in silence, in resignation, in neighborhoods where people are too tired to fight, too polite to push back. She ran the HOA like a kingdom, a small one, yes, but one where her word was rarely questioned. At least, not until that orange notice showed up on my door. I knew the type. I had seen it in court more times than I could count. Power that grew not from legitimacy, but from volume, from intimidation, from the calculated weaponization of bureaucracy. Miranda did not care whether her documents were real, only that they were loud enough, official enough, threatening enough to make people comply. But what she could not have known was that I had spent most of my adult life not just interpreting the law, but defining it. I knew every tactic, every loophole, every false premise hiding behind a forged signature, and I knew how to find the crack in the armor. Still, in those first few days after the notice, I did not act, not out of weakness, but out of mourning. Thomas would have known exactly what to do. He would have printed out copies of the land deed, the original boundary maps, highlighted every zoning clause, and walked them down to City Hall with that wry smile he used when someone underestimated him. Instead, I sat in the kitchen, looking at the nail they had left behind. It lay next to his mug, the one with the chipped rim he never replaced. And for a moment, I felt the quiet swallow me again. I was not afraid of Miranda. I was not afraid of the HOA. But I was tired of carrying the weight of a life that used to be shared. And yet, as I looked out the window toward the shed, the lake, the mist curling over the water like breath on glass, something shifted. They had not just threatened my land. They had dared to trespass on my memory. This cabin was not a house. It was a monument to love, to legacy, to a life built honestly and fiercely. To try and take that from me, with fake fees and fraudulent claims, was more than a mistake. It was provocation. I stood up from the table and walked into the study. The air still smelled faintly of cedar and printer ink. The walls were lined with law books I had not touched in months, and there, in the drawer beneath the locked file cabinet, was the deed. The original one, handwritten in fading ink, signed by my grandfather in 1947. Alongside it were the county-registered survey maps, each one showing in clear black and white. The boundary of my land ended 500 feet outside of the HOA's jurisdiction. It had always been mine. It would always be mine. And as I laid the papers out across the desk, one after the other, I felt something else return. Not rage, not fear. Purpose. Miranda Keller had made a mistake. She assumed I was just another widow in a quiet house, lost in grief. But I was not lost. I was waiting. And now I was awake. The morning after I retrieved the deed, I woke early. Earlier than usual. Not because I could not sleep. I had grown used to the silence. But because I had a feeling. The lake was quieter than normal. No wind, no ducks skimming the water. Just stillness, the kind that wraps itself around you like a warning. I stood at the kitchen sink, refilling the kettle, when I heard it. A low, throaty growl, mechanical and unfamiliar. Not a neighbor's truck, not the distant buzz of a lawnmower. This was something heavier, bigger. I stepped onto the porch just as the noise rounded the bend at the edge of my gravel road. A large dual-axle flatbed appeared, trailed by a yellow backhoe, whose hydraulic arm bounced slightly with each bump in the dirt. Behind the truck was a black pickup with two men in safety vests, one of them already on the radio. Their convoy rolled to a stop just shy of my driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the morning light like smoke. It looked like a construction site. But this was not a job site. This was a warning shot. I walked down to the end of the drive. The foreman, a tall man with a graying beard and a clipboard, stepped out of the truck. His boots hit the gravel with authority. He looked down at the papers in his hand, then up at me, squinting. "Eleanor Whitaker?" he asked. I nodded, slow and steady. "Name's Rick, Keller Contracting. We've got a work order to remove the non-compliant structure at the back of your lot, starting with the dock and boat shed." He said it as casually as if he were talking about trimming a hedge. I crossed my arms. "You will not touch a single board on this property." He sighed, clearly used to pushback. "Ma'am, I do not make the rules. I just follow the order. This was approved by the HOA, all official." He handed me a stapled packet of paper. The top sheet bore the seal of the Lakeshore Hills Homeowners Association, an image of a pine tree beside a calm lake meant to symbolize peace. But this morning, it felt like a threat. I did not read the entire document. I did not have to. I knew what it was. I saw the same tactics used by fraudsters in court for decades. It was paper armor, loud fonts, stamps, exaggerated wording, but no legal standing. It might have fooled someone who did not know better, but I did. I held it at my side and looked the man in the eye. This property is not under HOA jurisdiction. It never has been, and I have documents proving that. If you proceed, I will consider it trespassing, and I will act accordingly. Rick shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "Then you'll want to call your HOA president," he muttered, turning toward the truck. "I intend to," I said, already walking back inside. I set the papers on the kitchen counter and reached for the landline. No music, no pleasantries, just a direct dial to the number listed on the bottom of the notice. It rang twice. "Lakeshore Hills Association," a woman answered, her voice sugary and confident. "This is Miranda." Of course it was. "This is Judge Eleanor Whitaker," I said, not bothering with niceties. "There is a backhoe in front of my house and a demolition notice that bears your seal. Explain." She let out a soft laugh, the kind people use when they want you to feel small. "Oh, sweetie, that must be quite the surprise. But don't worry, it's all just paperwork. We'll clear it up soon. Sometimes these things get caught in the system, a clerical mix-up." "Miranda," I said, my tone cooling, "you've sent a crew to destroy private property. My deed predates your entire development. This land is not subject to your association's authority. Well, that's not what our vote shows, she said lightly. There was a community motion to annex the outer ring of properties last quarter. I'm sure you received the notice. No, I said. I did not. And even if I had, annexation does not override a recorded deed. You know that. She paused. Just briefly. Enough for me. To hear the wheels turning. She was playing a game, trying to keep it light, to make me question my own understanding. It was an old tactic, one I had ruled against many times. Well, she said finally, feel free to send in your documents. In the meantime, I would suggest settling the outstanding fees. It will save us both a headache. I hung up without another word. That afternoon, a manila envelope was delivered by hand. No postage, just dropped at the base of my front steps. Inside was a printed document titled Community Annexation Vote, Spring Session. A list of signatures followed, confirming the so-called expansion of the HOA's boundary, now including my property. I scanned the names. I knew most of them. Not personally, but I recognized them from neighborhood potlucks and mailboxes. The problem? 3 of the names belonged to people who no longer lived in the area. One had moved to Arizona 2 years prior. Another had passed away last summer. I remembered attending her memorial. The third had sold their home the year Thomas got sick. This was not incompetence. It was fraud. The next morning, I heard the sound of steel scraping pavement. When I looked out the window, a 30-yard construction dumpster was being lowered across my driveway. Its rust-red body landed with a deep, echoing thud that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the house. On the side, in white spray paint. Property of Lakeshore Hills. HOA, debris collection. My driveway was blocked. No vehicle could get in or out. I was boxed in. I walked out to the edge, arms crossed. The driver of the truck did not look at me. He climbed back in and drove away without a word. Not 5 minutes later, another envelope slid through the slot in my door. This one was thinner, but more absurd. It read, Second notice, payment required. Original balance, $14,982. Additional penalties assessed, $15, total due, $29,964. Failure to comply will result in escalation of enforcement procedures. There was no signature, no return address, just the familiar HOA logo, now twisted into something sinister. I stood in the hallway holding the paper, the container visible through the window behind me, blocking the path like a rusted barricade. The silence in the room deepened. Then I did something I had not done in months. I walked back to my desk, opened my address book, and dialed a number I once knew by heart. It rang once. Naomi Whitaker, a voice answered. Naomi, I said. I need you to come home. There was no hesitation. I'll be there tonight. The house was quieter than usual that afternoon. Even the old floorboards seemed to creak less, as if they too were holding their breath. The container outside loomed like a barricade, a blunt red insult to everything Thomas and I had built together. But inside, something had shifted. I sat at the dining room table, the notice still in my hand, the number $29,964 stamped across the top like a threat. For a long moment, I stared at it without blinking, not because it frightened me, but because of what it represented. This was not about money. It never was. This was about erasure, about dominance, about someone new trying to rewrite the history of a place she never helped build. I stood up and moved to the hallway. A narrow linen closet sat beside the stairs, painted the same soft white it had always been. Behind the towels and a dusty stack of old quilts was a box. It was not labeled. It did not need to be. I pulled it out carefully and carried it to the floor beside the hearth. The lid groaned as I opened it. Inside was our paper trail, the true story of this place, written in deeds and maps and blueprints. Some of it was fragile with age, the corners curled and the ink faded. But it was all there. Every proof of truth we had ever kept safe. I reached for the oldest document first, a hand-drawn plat map, the kind that still smelled faintly of tobacco and graphite. My grandfather's signature stood proud across the bottom. I could still hear his voice from when I was a little girl, explaining boundary lines to me as if they were holy. Land, he said, is not about fences. It is about memory, and paper makes memory permanent. Next came the deed, clean, simple, legally bulletproof. It had been recorded decades ago, long before Miranda Keller ever stepped foot in this state, and it clearly marked my property as private, unincorporated, and fully independent of any residential association. Then I found the survey Thomas and I had ordered when we built the cabin. He insisted on it, even though the county clerk said it was unnecessary. Paper first, nails second, he said with a wink. That made me smile. I ran my fingers along the rolled edges of the blueprint. The measurements were precise. The dock, the boat shed, the slope of the hill that led to the lake. All of it measured, recorded, notarized. Truth captured in ink. I set the documents aside and dug deeper into the box, searching for something more personal. And then I found it. Folded inside a manila envelope, yellowed with time, was a photograph. It was one I had nearly forgotten, or maybe just avoided looking at for too long. In it, I stood behind the bench of the federal courthouse in Denver, draped in my judicial robe, gavel in hand. My smile was small but sure. There was fire in my eyes then, the kind that only comes from knowing you have spent your life doing something that matters. Thomas had taken that picture. He had insisted I frame it, but I never did. Vanity, I said. But the truth was, I did not need to see it. I lived it. I stared at the image for a long time. The woman in the photo felt distant, like someone I used to know but had not spoken to in years. But she was still here, in the hands that steadied, papers instead of trembling, in the spine that straightened just a little as I stood to my feet. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and picked up the phone. Naomi answered on the first ring. "Aunt Ellie? Hi, honey. Thank you for picking up earlier." "Of course. I was already packing when you called. What happened?" I took a breath. "They blocked my driveway with a container, raised the fines. They hand-delivered a new notice this morning." Naomi was quiet for a moment. I could almost hear her setting her jaw. "They are escalating." "Yes," I said, "and I think it is time I escalate too." "You want me to come now?" "I do," I said. Then I paused, letting my voice settle, cool and calm like it had been in the courtroom. "I think it is time your old aunt reminded them who writes the law." She let out a breath through her nose, the kind I recognized. It was the same sound I used to make when I opened a difficult case file. "All right then," she said. "We do this by the book. We'll need your deed, your maps, any photos or timestamps, and every letter they have sent you." "I have everything," I replied. "I never doubted you. I'll be there before dark." After I hung up, I walked to the back window and looked out across the dock. It was still standing for now. The lake was calmer than it had been in days. No wind, just soft ripples brushing against the pilings. I could almost see Thomas sitting out there, legs crossed, a book in his lap, sipping that terrible instant coffee he liked so much. "This land is our legacy," he had said, the first day we nailed down the cabin frame. Not because it is ours to own, but because it is ours to protect. I nodded to myself. The papers were safe. The truth was intact. And I was no longer sitting in silence, waiting for the next shoe to drop. This was not grief anymore. This was memory turned into motion. And motion, as I always told my law clerks, is how change begins. It started with a knock, not on the door. They did not have that kind of decency. It came from the side of the house, the sharp thwack of tape being slapped onto wood. I opened the blinds and saw them, 3 of them, young, polos with the HOA logo embroidered above their hearts. They moved in a line, methodical, carrying rolls of red tape and laminated placards. One of them was pressing a label onto the garden bench Thomas built, right beside the raised flower beds we had filled with lavender last spring. The tag read, "Violation, non-compliant structure, must remove." I stepped out onto the porch. They did not look up. Another placard was taped to the mailbox post, then to the trellis, then to the wooden bird feeder shaped like a lighthouse. Each one bore the same message, short, absurd, and terrifying in its impersonation of authority. "What exactly are you tagging?" I asked, voice level, calm. One of the boys, he could not have been more than 25, glanced over his shoulder. He looked amused. "These are all in breach of Lakeshore Hills appearance codes," he said. "Exterior design elements must conform to woodland neutrality." I blinked. Woodland neutrality? "Natural wood tones, beige, sage green, or charcoal gray," he recited. "That birdhouse is red." "It has been red for 17 years, I said. "It matches the lighthouse on the far shore." He shrugged. Behind him, another of the workers snickered. "Maybe she'll just move to assisted living like the others." I felt my breath catch, not out of sadness, not from insult, from clarity. That was what this was about, not enforcement, not neighborhood pride. It was displacement, targeted, deliberate, and cruel. They wanted me gone. I turned and walked back into the house without another word. My hands moved before my thoughts caught up. I picked up the phone and scrolled down to a number I had not dialed in years. Marianne answered on the third ring. "I was wondering how long it would take," she said. Her voice was warm, familiar, and bracing, like stepping into a hot shower after standing in cold rain. "I need you," I said. "What did they do?" "They tagged my garden bench, my birdhouse. They blocked my driveway with a dumpster, and they doubled the fake fees." She was silent for a beat. "Send me everything," she said. "Photos, documents, names. I'll run their nonprofit filings, look into their vendor contracts, and pull the original neighborhood charter. I also have the deed," I said, "and the map, and a list of signatures on a vote that never happened." Her tone sharpened. "You already have a case. Now we build a story." "I knew you'd say that." We exchanged a few more details, just enough to get her started, and then I hung up and walked into my office. The space had sat untouched for months, still bearing the faint outline of the last letter Thomas wrote to the county about repairing the dock. But now it hummed with urgency. I pulled out a yellow notepad, the kind I had used on the bench for years, and began writing. Itemized record of every violation posted, date and time of every notice delivered, names of HOA representatives observed on the property, license plate numbers of vehicles entering the driveway, exact language used in all communications, especially threats or suggestions of relocation. Each line steadied me. This was not rage. This was evidence. This was strategy. I set up my phone near the front window and activated the video recorder. The lens caught the edge of the container, the mailbox, and the boys still tagging trees at the edge of my yard. I narrated quietly, date, time, summary of actions, just like I had been trained to do in court when documenting evidence for judicial review. Then I moved through the house, taking still photos. Each tag, each taped corner, each insult printed in red plastic. They wanted me to feel embarrassed, small, isolated, but every sticker they posted only deepened my resolve. By the time Naomi arrived just before sunset, I had compiled a 26-page file, scanned copies of everything, complete with annotations and a spreadsheet tracking escalation. She looked through the file in silence, flipping each page with the efficiency of a campaign aide reviewing an ethics complaint. She had changed out of her blazer, but still wore the energy of someone who spent her days walking marble hallways and writing policy briefs. When she finished, she set the binder down and looked at me. "They do not know who they are dealing with," she said. "I think they will soon," I replied. We stood together at the front window, watching the last of the red tag crew climb into their pickup and drive away. Tomorrow we would begin. Not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with letters, with legal citations, with timestamps and filings. This would not be loud, but it would be felt. By Monday morning, my kitchen table looked less like a place for tea and more like a war room. Naomi had spread out her laptop, a printer, 2 file folders color-coded by incident date, and a stack of printed forms she was filling out with surgical focus. I stood at the stove, steeping Earl Grey, the same way I had every morning for years. Except now, my kitchen was filled with the quiet rhythm of strategy, the hum of the printer, the clatter of keys, the soft flipping of paper. No one was raising their voice. No one needed to. This was not a fight for volume. This was a fight for the truth. And we were done waiting. Naomi reached for a manila envelope she had prepped the night before. "I am sending a formal request under the Colorado HOA Transparency Act," she said. They are required to provide all meeting minutes, financial records, and annexation votes upon request. If they refuse or delay, they are in breach of statute. She had highlighted the relevant law on the cover letter in bright yellow. No room for interpretation. Mary Ann had also been busy. At 9 o'clock sharp, she published her first article online. The headline read, "Who is Miranda Keller, the HO? A Queen of Forged Borders." It featured side-by-side images. One of Miranda posing in front of a podium at a local event, smiling like a polished politician. The other, a blurry photo of a red dumpster blocking my driveway, tagged with the HOA logo in white spray paint. Mary Ann was careful. Always was. Every line in the article was sourced. She cited the questionable annexation vote, the list of signatures that included deceased or relocated residents, and the growing number of complaints from neighbors who had received sudden citations after Miranda took control. It was not an exposé yet, not officially, but it was enough to get attention. The article gained traction within hours. Comments poured in, some in support, some in fear, some simply stunned. A few residents shared stories of their own, being fined for leaving their porch lights on after dusk, or receiving threats for planting flowers that were too colorful. One comment simply read, "We were too scared to say it, but she's out of control." By noon, the HOA's official email inbox was full. We knew because one of Naomi's college friends, a municipal clerk, quietly forwarded us the server bounce notifications. The dam had cracked, but we were just getting started. While Naomi pressed forward with the legal channels and Mary Ann worked the press, I made a call of my own, one I had not made in over a decade. Judge Henry Roebuck had been a colleague of mine when I was still on the federal bench. He had since moved into a county judgeship after retirement, for a slower pace, he claimed, though we all knew he liked the gavel too much to fully let go. He answered on the second ring. "Ellie," he said, "I'll be damned." "Henry," I replied, "I'm calling in a favor. A big one. Tell me." I explained everything, the forged vote, the red tags, the sudden annexation that smelled more like a land grab than a neighborhood improvement plan. I told him I had the deed, the documents, and now a full-blown harassment campaign backed by trucks, dumpsters, and threats. He listened in silence, only interjecting to ask for names or statute numbers. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. "They are either very confident," he said, "or very stupid. Maybe both. You want a temporary injunction?" "I want time," I said. "Enough to stop them from touching anything else until this is sorted." "Done," he said. "I'll file it under emergency review. You'll have it by end of day." By 4 o'clock, Naomi printed out the court order and taped it to the inside of my front window, directly facing the street. It read, "Temporary injunction granted. No alterations or removal of property permitted pending judicial review. No vehicle, no backhoe, no HOA agent would legally be allowed to so much as pluck a flower from my yard now, without risking contempt of court." It was a small pause in a larger battle, but it bought us time, and time was what we needed. Mary Ann called just after sunset. "You were right," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "I dug into their vendor contracts. You know that cleanup company Miranda keeps hiring? Keller Contracting? Her brother-in-law owns it. The LLC was registered 3 months after she became HOA president. And guess what? They have billed the association over $200,000 in the last 2 years for site remediation and enforcement logistics." I sat down. "Has any of that work been documented?" "None of it. No permits, no city receipts. And the address they list for job sites? Most of them are vacant properties that ended up sold within 6 months of code enforcement. Letters." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. It was worse than I thought. This was not just bullying. This was a racket. They were creating fake violations, then sending in their own company to clean up the property, either to intimidate homeowners into selling or to force a transfer of ownership once debt stacked too high to fight. It was an old scheme, one I had seen before, just never this close to home. "They do not want my land," I said quietly. "They want me gone, off the record, out of the way." Naomi looked up from the table. "They wanted silence," I nodded. "Instead, they got me." That night, the lights in the kitchen stayed on long after the sun went down. The table held more paper than wood. Marianne called in again with screenshots of HOA filings showing inconsistencies in the dates of the annexation process. Naomi drafted a follow-up request for Miranda's personal communications while acting in an official capacity. And I sat at the center of it all, calm, cold, clear. The judge was awake again, and the gavel was in my hands. For days I watched the lumber stack outside the dock grow inch by inch, not from deliveries, but from intention. Naomi and I had arranged the boards in a neat, deliberate pile, just enough to suggest a project, not enough to warrant immediate suspicion. A few beams laid beside a fresh bag of cement, unopened. 2 paint cans, carefully scuffed to look used, sat near a coiled extension cord. And on the workbench inside the garage, directly in view of the main road, was a set of architectural sketches, fakes drawn with pencil and ruler and labeled in bold, careful handwriting. Boathouse. Expansion. Phase 1. It was bait. And we were counting on Miranda Keller's pride to take it. We knew her by now. Her rhythms, her control, her deep need to own everything she could not reach. She had tried to erase my history with paper, then with demolition, then with shame. She had failed. And now we were giving her one last shot, one final opportunity to break the law in broad daylight. Only this time, we would be watching. Naomi's college friend, a cybersecurity specialist, had lent us 4 motion-triggered cameras, each one no bigger than a golf ball, tucked into places no one would think to look. One in the birdhouse overlooking the dock, another beneath the gutter near the garage, a third inside a decorative lantern on the porch, and the last, my favorite, hidden in the branches of the crepe myrtle outside the kitchen window, with a perfect view of the entire yard. They fed footage wirelessly to a secure server Naomi had linked to her phone. Every time movement crossed the threshold, we received an alert. Most of the time, it was birds. Once, it was a lost cat. But we waited, and on the 3rd morning, we saw her. The alert buzzed around 11:14 a.m. Naomi held up her phone as I walked into the room, the screen already loading the feed. There she was, Miranda Keller. She had parked at the end of the main road, where HOA trucks often idled to avoid being seen. She wore heels, a powder blue blazer, and carried her phone like it was a weapon. She walked slowly, with purpose, right past the mailbox, right down my private drive. Her eyes scanned everything, the lumber, the paint, the drawings taped to the garage window. She circled the dock as if inspecting it, taking photos without consent. Her expression was smug, satisfied. She saw what she thought was a violation, a rebuild in progress, and assumed I had finally slipped, or that she had finally caught me. What she did not realize was that the entire walk, the photos, the intrusion, it was all being captured in crystal clarity from 4 different angles, and we were not the only ones watching. At exactly 11:22 a.m., the gravel road rumbled. A black unmarked SUV pulled into the drive, followed by another with tinted windows, the kind that do not have hubcaps, the kind that signal trouble if you have something to hide. Miranda turned, startled. The vehicles came to a stop, forming a wall between her and the exit. The doors opened slowly. From the first car stepped 2 agents, suits, clean cuts, no introductions necessary. From the second, the sheriff himself emerged, followed by a deputy carrying a thick envelope. I had known Sheriff Burke for 20 years. He used to bring his boys to fish off our dock when they were still in Cub Scouts. But today, his face was all business. Miranda took a half step back. She was still holding her phone, still gripping the illusion of control. "I am the HOA president," she said sharply, trying to reclaim the moment. "This is unauthorized construction on community-managed land. I have full authority to enforce compliance." Sheriff Burke held up a hand. "Ma'am," he said, "you are currently standing on private property, and you are trespassing." He nodded to one of the agents who produced a printed photo, the same image we had captured earlier, time-stamped, showing her inside my property line. Then Burke motioned to his deputy, who stepped forward and handed her the envelope. "Search warrant," he said, "for your residence, office, and all digital communications made in your role as HOA president." She froze. One of the agents stepped forward. "Ma'am, please put your phone down." "This is outrageous," she hissed. "I have done nothing wrong." "You have," I said quietly. She turned. I stood at the edge of the porch, hands folded, calm as ever. Her mouth opened slightly, as if surprised to see me not shrinking, not hiding, just watching. "You tried to take my home," I said. "But that was not enough. You tried to take my name, my history. You tried to make me small." She said nothing. "You used fake documents. You fined grieving neighbors into silence. You created rules to profit and fear to enforce them. And worst of all, you believed no one would stop you." Her face had gone pale. "I was a federal judge for 24 years, I continued. "I have sentenced men for far less." Then Dana spoke. She had been silent until now, standing just behind the sheriff. She stepped forward, holding a federal badge. Her voice was cool, practiced. "Miranda Keller, under Title 18 of the United States Code, you are being investigated for wire fraud, mail fraud, falsification of municipal records, and conspiracy to defraud property owners under color of authority." Miranda took a shaky breath. "This is not happening," she whispered. But it was. One of the agents pulled out a pair of cuffs. They were quiet, unassuming, metal circles that closed with the softest click. No yelling, no resistance. Just the sound of a woman watching her kingdom collapse in the sunlight. As they read her the Miranda rights, ironic given her name, I watched from the steps of the home she tried to steal. I did not smile. I did not speak again. I simply watched, steady and silent, as the illusion of her power was peeled away like paper from glass. She had written false laws. We had answered with real ones, and the reckoning had come, not in fury, but in form. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered, not in size, but in presence. I had spent decades inside these rooms, presiding from the bench, guiding proceedings with the weight of the law at my back. But today, I sat in the gallery, 3 rows from the front, hands folded in my lap. I was not the one passing judgment, not this time. I was just one of the many waiting to hear it spoken. Miranda Keller sat across the room, no longer in her pressed blazers or tidy pearls, but in the pale blue of a county holding uniform. Her posture had shrunk, shoulders curled inward like a leaf folding against frost. She no longer looked like a queen, just a woman who had confused control with power, and lost both. The charges were read in a clear, steady voice. Abuse of authority, falsification of official documents, conspiracy to defraud, embezzlement of HOA funds, trespass with intent to harass. The judge, a woman I had once mentored, moved swiftly. The case was airtight, the evidence overwhelming. The fake annexation maps, the misappropriated funds paid to her brother-in-law's contracting company, the rigged votes signed by residents who had long since left. All of it laid bare like a cracked foundation. And then came the restitution order. Miranda Keller was ordered to personally fund the full reconstruction of the boathouse her contractors had threatened to tear down, not through HOA funds, which by then had been frozen by court order, but out of her own assets. She would also reimburse all illegitimate fees charged to residents over the past 3 years, including mine. Finally, the court mandated the dissolution of the Lakeshore Hills HOA. Its charter was revoked, its leadership stripped of authority, and independent receiver was appointed to handle its closure and oversee the creation of a new resident-led board, one voted in by those it was meant to serve, not control. There was no applause when the gavel fell, just silence, a deep, settling kind of silence, the kind that follows thunder. Later that week, a series of envelopes appeared in my mailbox, none of them marked with red tape this time, handwritten notes, folded cards. A few had small bouquets attached, wrapped in twine. Most began the same way. "I'm sorry." One was from the man who once complained about my garden gnome. Another came from the couple who had nodded politely but avoided eye contact at the store after the first false notice was posted to my door. There were 12 in total. Neighbors, strangers, people who had been afraid to speak when the system seemed too loud to resist. Some admitted they had believed Miranda at first. Others said they had doubted her, but felt powerless to act. A few simply thanked me for not giving in, for fighting back. One letter stood out. It was from a single mother who lived 3 streets over. When they fined me for my porch swing being painted the wrong color, I almost cried. I thought maybe I was crazy or lazy or just not good enough for this neighborhood. But then I saw your story. I saw someone older, wiser, standing against the same fear I felt. And I realized maybe I wasn't the one who needed to change. I read that one twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer beside the deed to my land. The day the boathouse was rebuilt, the lake was calm again. Just a soft ripple of breeze brushing the water, the sun catching it in glints like tiny coins. The crew was quiet, respectful. Some were volunteers, neighbors who had asked if they could help. A few brought tools, others brought coffee. They put the new boards in place where the old ones had been torn up, layered fresh cedar over the memories, but did not erase them. At my request, they left a single plank of the original dock, weathered and cracked, stained by time, right in the center of the floor. I walked out to it that evening after the hammering had stopped. The air smelled of sawdust and lakeweed. I sat on the edge of the new dock, my legs dangling just above the surface, and listened. Birdsong, distant laughter, and the hush of wind through the trees. Justice had not come as a roar. It had arrived as a steady hand, as a stack of carefully gathered papers, as a daughter and a niece and a sister who believed silence was not surrender. I thought of Thomas, his voice, his laugh, the way he always made me proofread every letter twice before mailing it. I wished he had seen this. He would have said something quietly triumphant, then handed me a mug of coffee and gone back to planting tomatoes. But I think in some way he had seen it, in every document I pulled from our file cabinet, in every board they rebuilt on the dock, in the fact that the cabin still stood, not as a fortress, but as a witness. Naomi sat beside me a moment later, her hand resting gently on mine. "You did it," she said. I shook my head. "We did it." She smiled, then turned to watch the sun dip behind the trees. A breeze moved through the pines, and I said, softly, almost to myself, "That's what justice really is. Not loud, not angry, just necessary." The kettle whistled just as the light changed outside, that soft golden hour glow that only seems to exist beside water. I moved slowly, carefully, as I poured the tea into 3 cups, letting the steam rise between us like a curtain being pulled back on a quiet stage. Outside, the new dock stood clean and steady, its fresh boards still glowing with that raw cedar hue. But in the center, just where it should be, was that one older plank, the one Thomas and I had placed with our own hands decades ago. Time had weathered it, darkened the grain, left the edges worn and smooth from countless bare feet. But it held, just like we had. Naomi was already out on the porch, her shoes kicked off, a book forgotten in her lap. Beside her, Mary Ann was scribbling in a small leather journal, one she always carried but rarely shared. She said writing was her form of remembering. She wrote to preserve things the world was too quick to forget. I handed each of them a mug. Neither spoke. We had said what needed saying already. Instead, we sat, 3 women bound not by blood alone, but by choice, by conviction, by the simple, unshakable refusal to be erased. The lake stretched out before us, quiet and still, like it was holding its breath along with us. "I didn't fight because I was angry," I said, more to the breeze than to them. "I fought because Thomas and I built this land with love, and love is always worth defending." Mary Ann looked up from her notebook, her eyes soft. "And now others will know that," she said. Naomi smiled, turning her face toward the dock. "It's not just about land, is it?" I shook my head slowly. "No," I said, "it never was." For a long time, I had lived in silence, believing that age made you smaller, that when the world grew louder, your best response was to become quieter. But now, I understood something I had once taught a room full of law clerks many years ago. Silence can be powerful, but it should never be mistaken for surrender. I had watched neighbors retreat. I had felt it myself, the shrinking, the second-guessing, the weight of someone else's rules pressing down on you like fog you cannot see through. But then came the moment when someone nails a lie to your front door, and you realize, if you do not speak, they will write the ending for you. Not this time. This time, the story belonged to us. From across the lake, a few children's voices echoed, high and sweet. Someone was skipping stones. A breeze rustled through the trees, the first hint of summer warmth lingering in the ease, pine-scented air. Marianne raised her mug slightly in a small toast. To what was lost and rebuilt. Naomi joined her, their mugs clinking softly in the stillness. And I smiled. Not a victorious smile, not smug or self-satisfied. Just settled, balanced, at peace. The kind of smile that says, I am still here, and I am not afraid of being seen. So now, I ask you, the one holding this story in your hands, or hearing it in your ear, have you ever seen someone try to erase your life with a smile? Did they tell you the rules had changed when you were not looking? Did they ask for silence, not because it was kind, but because it made you easier to control? Then, I hope you remember this. You do not have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be steady. And when the time comes to speak, even a whisper can carry farther than the fear. Share your story, because silence should never mean surrender.